The report was only 3 pages long. That was the first thing Sector Magistrate Voreth noticed when the courier placed it on the council table. Not its contents, not its author, not the 7 authentication seals pressed into its lower margin like wounds. Just the thinness of it. 3 pages from a general who had spent 4 years in direct observation of the human species. 3 pages when the standing protocol for first contact behavioral assessments required a minimum of 200. Voreth picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. The courier had already left the room. The council chamber of the hegemonic deliberative, oldest continuous governing body in the known cluster, 3,000 years of unbroken institutional memory embedded in its walls, held 9 members that morning. 8 of them were laughing before the second page. Only General Tessavor Ind was not laughing. She stood at the far end of the table with her hands clasped behind her back. Her posture the particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from decision. A person who has already moved past the moment everyone else is still living in. "Read the 3rd page," she said. Counselor Merith waved a hand. "General, with respect, you've submitted a threat assessment recommending Category 7 escalation protocols for a species that has not yet achieved faster than light travel, has no unified planetary government, is actively at war with itself across multiple continents, and whose most advanced energy weapon," he paused here to consult his secondary notes, visibly suppressing amusement, "whose most advanced energy weapon has an effective range of approximately 800 meters. Morse." "Read the 3rd page," Tessavor said again. "We've read it. You've looked at it. That's not the same thing." The laughter faded, not because anyone took her seriously yet, but because her tone had shifted into something that made laughter feel suddenly inappropriate without anyone being able to explain why. Voreth pulled the report toward him and read the 3rd page again, slowly this time. He would later describe this moment, in private, years later, to someone he trusted, as the sensation of stepping onto a staircase in the dark and finding that the step is lower than expected, not dangerous, not painful. Just the sudden disorienting awareness that the floor is not where you believed it to be. He set the report down. He did not laugh again. "General," he said carefully, "this section here, the behavioral observation logs. You're describing a species that, when faced with an unwinnable tactical situation, does not retreat, does not negotiate, and does not surrender. Correct. And your interpretation of this is not," he searched for the word pathology. "I had the same interpretation for the first 18 months, Tessavor said. "I was wrong. Read what comes after." What came after was a 6-line summary of an incident that General Tessavor Ind had personally witnessed from a hegemonic observation vessel in high orbit above the 3rd human continent during the species' 87th recorded military engagement since her arrival. The incident, in its barest form, a human military unit of approximately 300 individuals, had been encircled by a force 8 times its size. All communication with their command structure had been severed. All supply lines had been cut. They had been without food for 9 days, without medical resupply for 14, and without a plausible path to survival for, by Tessavori's calculation, approximately 3 weeks. They had held their position for 61 days. At the end of day 61, 11 of the 300 were still alive. Those 11 had then, without orders, without coordination from any external command, without any logical reason to believe their actions would have strategic value, launched an offensive. They had won. That was not the part that had changed Tessavor's mind. The part that had changed her mind was what she had observed on day 38, through the orbital sensors at maximum magnification, when she had first begun to suspect that her original assessment had been catastrophically incomplete. She had watched one of the humans, one of the wounded ones, a medic whose name she would not learn for another 2 years. She had watched this person crawl in the dark, under fire, across 60 meters of contested ground to reach a soldier who had called out. The soldier who had called out was already dead when the medic arrived. The medic had stayed with the body for 4 minutes, then crawled back. Tessivore had spent the next 3 hours in her observation deck trying to construct a logical framework that explained this behavior in terms her training could accommodate. The medic had expended energy, risked death, and gained nothing tactically. By any rational calculus, the behavior made no sense. By the end of those 3 hours, she had concluded that her training was the problem, not the human. They don't perform cost-benefit analysis the same way we do, she told the council now. That's not a limitation, that's the point. The council's laughter had fully died by now, replaced by something more complicated. Not fear yet, not quite concern, but a restless quality. The mental discomfort of people who have been handed a piece of information that does not fit inside any existing category and therefore cannot be dismissed or acted upon through standard procedure. Counselor Morath leaned forward. You're suggesting we escalate to Category 7 because humans are emotionally inefficient? I'm suggesting, Tessivore said, that what you're calling emotional inefficiency is actually a form of strategic behavior that our models are constitutionally incapable of predicting. A pause. And I'm suggesting that a species whose behavior cannot be predicted cannot be managed. And a species that cannot be managed, when it eventually reaches the stars, she stopped. Let the sentence stay unfinished. Counselor Fessick, who had said nothing since the meeting began, spoke for the first time. How long until they reach faster-than-light capability? Current projection, Tessivore said, is 60 to 90 years. Then we have time. We thought we had time with the Erath. We had time with the Vosk Confederacy. We had time. Tessivore's voice did not rise, but it tightened in a way that silenced the room more completely than volume ever could, right up until we didn't. Vorith was still staring at the report, at the 6-line incident summary, at the number 11. 11 survivors out of 300. 11 people who had looked at the situation they were in and decided, on no authority, with no resources, after 61 days of conditions that should have destroyed them, that they weren't finished yet. What happened to the medic? He asked. The one who crawled to the body. Tessivore looked at him for a moment. She survived. And she went back to work the next morning. The council voted 6-2 against escalation. The official record would later describe this as a decision made in accordance with standard threat assessment protocol, supported by the available data, and representing the considered judgment of the hegemonic deliberative's most experienced policy architects. General Tessivore Ind filed a formal objection, 11 pages this time. She then returned to Earth orbit, to her observation post, and went back to work. Her name was Corporal Yara Osei, and she was 23 years old, and she was angry about the coffee. This was, in her own assessment, a deeply unreasonable thing to be angry about, given that the forward operating base had been under intermittent artillery fire for the past 6 days, and the water recycler had broken, and 2 people from 3rd Squad were dead, and the tactical situation was what she would describe, privately, as bad in a way that keeps finding new ways to get worse. But the coffee machine was broken, and it had been broken for 11 days, and whoever had been responsible for logging the repair request had apparently not done so. And so the anger about the coffee was there, vivid and specific, and real in a way that the larger catastrophe somehow wasn't, not fully, not yet. She was sitting on an ammunition crate in the back of the medical bay, eating a protein bar that tasted like chalk and regret, when Sergeant Marcus Delacroix dropped down beside her. "You have that face," he said. "I have a face. That specific face. The one that means you're thinking about something that isn't what you're actually thinking about." Yara looked at him. Delacroix was 10 years older than her and had been in the field for 15. and he had the particular quality of experienced soldiers who had decided at some point that sincerity was more efficient than its alternative. He was not always right. He was usually honest. She had decided somewhere in the past 4 months that this combination was worth more to her than she had expected. "The coffee machine is broken," she said. "I know. 11 days. I know. Someone was supposed to log the repair request. Yara." He said her name the way people say names when they want to redirect without confrontation. "What are we actually talking about?" She finished the protein bar, crumpled the wrapper, held it in her hand because there was nowhere to put it. "Renner and Osagi," she said. "Third squad. The 2 who were dead. I keep running him back. If I'd been 20 minutes faster with the second triage kit, you weren't 20 minutes slower. The situation was 20 minutes faster. That's the same thing." "It really isn't." She didn't answer. Outside, something rumbled, distant enough to be okay, close enough to register in the sternum, that specific frequency that the body learns to categorize, after enough time, as background rather than threat. She hated that she had learned to do that. She hated what the learning required. "We're going to hold this position," Delacroix said. "I know. I mean specifically. Commands confirmed the reinforcement window. 18 days, maybe 20. 18 days, she repeated. Not as a question, as a thing being weighed. "You've done harder." She looked at him then, really looked, and what she felt was not exactly reassurance and not exactly fear and not exactly anything she had a name for. Just the particular quality of a moment that already knows it's going to matter later, that plants itself in memory even as it's happening before anything has been resolved. "The coffee machine better be fixed by then," she said. Delacroix almost smiled. "I'll put in the request myself." In high orbit, Tessavor Ind adjusted her sensor array and made a note in her observation log. Day 1461. FOB Kestrel 9, Eastern Continent, unit strength 47. Under sustained pressure, no indication of withdrawal preparation. Medical officer, female, approx. 23 years. Behavioral flag, grief processing through displacement. Functional. Continuing. She paused, added one more line. "They are angry about small things. I have been trying to understand why. I think it may be how they stay." She closed the log, opened the one she kept separately, the one she had never submitted to the council, the one that was simply her own thinking, unmediated by protocol. The Irath, in their final confrontation with us, calculated the exact moment at which continued resistance became statistically irrational and stopped. The Vosk did the same. Every species we have ever encountered has, at some point, performed that calculation and accepted its conclusion. I have been watching these humans for 4 years. I have not yet identified the point at which they perform that calculation. I am beginning to suspect they do not have one. 18 days became 22. The reinforcement window slipped, then slipped again, then was officially reclassified as operationally uncertain, which was a phrase Yara had learned to translate as "do not plan around this." The unit at FOB Kestrel 9 went from 47 to 31, then to 26. Then to 24 when a wall section collapsed and 2 people went with it, which was not enemy action, just gravity and fatigue and materials pushed past their tolerance, which somehow felt worse. On day 31, Delacroix found Yara inventorying the remaining medical supplies for the 3rd time that week. "You've already counted those. I'm seeing if the count changed." "Did it? No. Which is the problem?" She set down the kit, rubbed her face with both hands. "We have enough for maybe 4 more serious interventions. After that, I'm working with field improvisation and a very good attitude." "Your attitude isn't that good." "I know." She turned to look at him. There was something different in her face now. Not defeat, nothing close to defeat, but the specific quality of a person who has stripped away everything that isn't essential and is now operating from whatever is underneath. Delacroix had seen it before, in other people, in himself, once, in a mirror, at a moment he didn't revisit. Marcus, what's actually happening out there? Command. The window. Tell me straight. He was quiet for long enough that she knew the answer before he spoke. The window's not coming, he said. Not in the next week. Maybe not in 2. So we hold. She nodded, turned back to the supplies, picked up the kit again, began counting for the 4th time, not because the number would change, but because the act of counting was itself a thing, a way of being present, of insisting on the specific reality of what was here, what was knowable, what was hers to manage in a situation that had stopped being manageable by any reasonable definition. There's something I need to tell you, she said, without looking up. Okay. When Renner died, I made it there in time. There was a window, a narrow one, where intervention might have. She stopped, started again. I chose to stabilize Osigui first. Triage protocol. Expected survival rates. The math, said Osigui. The math was right. Osigui died 4 hours later. Delacroix said nothing. So I made the correct decision, Yara said, and got the worst possible outcome. And I know that's how it works. I know that's the job, and I also know that I will be thinking about that specific decision for the rest of my life, regardless of whether it was right. She finally looked up. I just needed to say it out loud to someone. Delacroix put his hand on her shoulder, not speaking, not explaining, just present in the specific way that presence can be its own form of answer. Above them, Tessivore Ind was watching through the orbital sensors, and she had been trained to record, to categorize, to analyze, and she had done all 3 for 4 years. Tonight she simply watched. The report she filed the next morning was not 3 pages. It was 1 sentence. I have observed something I do not have a category for, and I believe this is the most important piece of information the hegemonic deliberative has ever received. The council did not respond. This is where the official hegemonic historical record, as Vorth would eventually discover, becomes interesting. Because the council's non-response to Tessevor's 1-sentence report was logged, filed, and archived in the standard manner. What was not logged, not filed, and not archived through any standard channel was the meeting that occurred 9 days later, the meeting that was not on any official calendar, attended by 4 of the 9 council members in a room that, according to the building's access records, was unoccupied that entire day. Vorth found out about this meeting 3 years later, through a method he would describe as not entirely authorized, and what he found destroyed 2 of the assumptions he had been operating under since the original report. The first assumption was that the council had dismissed Tessivore's concerns because they believed she was wrong. She had not been dismissed because anyone believed she was wrong. She had been dismissed because 4 of the council members had already sent a separate classified assessment team to Earth 6 months before Tessivore's arrival. A team whose findings they had not shared with Tessivore. A team whose findings they had not shared with the full council. The second assumption, this one harder to absorb, harder to accept, was that the classified team's assessment had agreed with Tessivore. Not partially, not in qualified terms, completely. The classified assessment, filed under a document code that did not appear in any index Vorith had ever been given access to, concluded, in language so measured and institutional that its terror could only be felt by reading slowly, that humanity represented a category of existential risk for which the hegemony had no established protocol, because the hegemony's entire conflict management framework was built on a foundational premise that, in humanity's case, did not apply. The premise that every rational civilization, when faced with sufficient cost, will eventually stop. The assessment's conclusion in its final line, we cannot currently determine whether this premise applies to the human species. We recommend treating the possibility that it does not as the planning assumption. The 4 council members who had commissioned this report had then voted against escalation. Voreth read this finding in his private office, alone at 2 in the morning, and sat still for a very long time. FOB Kestrel 9, day 44. The unit was down to 19. Yara had not slept more than 3 hours consecutively in 11 days. She had performed 7 surgical interventions with equipment designed for 2 and materials designed for field stabilization rather than sustained treatment. 2 of those interventions had succeeded by any clinical definition. 3 had succeeded by the definition she was currently operating under, which was, the person is still alive and still functional, which means, I do the next thing. The remaining 2 she did not think about in clinical terms at all. She thought about them in the specific language of grief that has to be deferred, the kind that gets put in a box and sealed and placed somewhere internal where it will wait, patiently, for a time that may never actually come. Delacroix found her at 0300, sitting outside the medical bay on the ground with her back against the wall and her face turned up toward a sky she couldn't see through the cloud cover. You should be sleeping, he said. I know. He sat down beside her. The gesture itself was its own kind of statement, a person choosing to be uncomfortable rather than absent. Tell me something true, she said. We're running out of time. That's not, she started to object, then didn't. Okay. Yes, what else? 19 people is not 0. No. And as long as it's not 0, I know. She turned to look at him. Marcus, if it gets to the point where, if there's a choice between the position and the people, that's a command decision. I'm asking what you do. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she understood he was being honest rather than quick. The position has value because there are people in it, he finally said. That's my answer. I know it's not doctrine. It's mine too. She looked back up at the covered sky. I just needed to know we agreed. Something cracked in the middle distance. Not artillery, just the structural settling of a damaged building somewhere in the compound. Both of them tracked it automatically, assessed it automatically, filed it in the correct internal category, and returned to the conversation without discussion. This was what 44 days did. The coffee machine is still broken, she said. Despite everything, he laughed. In her observation log, Tessavor wrote, I have been trying for 4 years to understand why they make jokes. Tonight, I think I finally understand. It is not a failure to perceive the seriousness of the situation. It is a refusal to be fully owned by it. Humor is not escapism. It is resistance. She paused, added, every civilization we have encountered under sufficient pressure eventually becomes the pressure. They become what is being done to them. Frightened species become fear itself. Desperate species become desperation. These humans, under pressure I would classify as sufficient to cause complete psychological collapse in any species I have studied, somehow remain themselves. The medic makes jokes. The sergeant tells truth. They are still, recognizably, the same people I observed on day 1. I do not know how to classify a species that cannot be psychologically conquered. She flagged this entry, filed it under the separate log, then did something she had never done in 30 years of observation duty. She filed it to the council marked Urgent, Existential Category, Recurs Immediate Respertsen. The response came back in 6 hours. General Tessavor End. Your continued flagging of this observation file for urgent review is noted. Your assessment remains on record. No change in deliberative position is currently anticipated. Please continue your observation mandate. She read this response once, set it down, returned to her sensors. Below, Yara Osei was sleeping in 3-hour intervals and counting medical supplies and keeping 19 people alive in conditions that should have allowed for none of those things. Tessavor picked up her private log. wrote one more line. They are going to reach the stars, and when they do, I genuinely do not know what will happen. I know that every assumption we have built our civilization around will be tested. I know that the testing will not be gentle. I know that I have tried to warn them and they will not listen. I know that the council is afraid, and that fear is making them small rather than careful. And I know this is the part I cannot file, cannot submit, cannot make official. I know that if it comes to an actual confrontation, I am not certain we should win. Day 59. The reinforcement column arrived 17 days late and found 13 survivors. Yara Osi was one of them. She was standing in the entrance of the medical bay when the column's lead vehicle stopped and the commanding officer stepped out, and what he saw was a woman who looked like she had come through something that didn't have a name yet. Not broken, not defeated, something else. Something that had been refined, stripped, reduced to its most essential and enduring element, standing on the far side of an experience that changes what a person is made of. He started to speak. She held up a hand. I need to tell you something before you go inside, she said. Corporal, 9 of my people are in there. 3 are in critical condition. 4 are stable but will need immediate surgical capability, not field intervention. 2 are, she stopped, reorganized. 2 have injuries. I have done everything I can do with what I had, and what happens next depends on what you brought. The officer, Colonel Reeves, she would learn later, a man with 26 years of service and a reputation for composure, looked at her for a moment, then said very quietly, "What do you need?" It was the right question. Later, much later, she would try to explain to someone why those 4 words mattered as much as they did, and she would have difficulty, because the difficulty is that the explanation requires understanding what it feels like to have been the only person deciding what comes next for 59 days, to have been the node through which every decision about who might live flowed, to have carried that in the specific and exhausting way that responsibility carried alone becomes its own kind of weight. And then to have someone ask, not what happened, not how you managed, but what do you need, which is a question that treats you as a person with needs rather than a resource with outputs. She told him what she needed. He provided it. 6 of the 9 survived. The council met again 11 weeks later. The occasion was a revised First Contact Protocol proposal submitted by General Tessivor Ind. The proposal was 19 pages. She had added significantly since the 3-page original. Vorith read every word. The meeting went badly. You're recommending, Counselor Merith said in a tone that had replaced amusement with something colder, that we make formal diplomatic contact, openly, with a species that is not only pre-FTL but actively destabilized, internally divided, and, by your own observation data, psychologically unpredictable under pressure. Yes. On the grounds that if we wait until they develop FTL capability independently, the first contact will be, he checked his notes, conducted on their terms rather than ours. Yes. General. A pause. Do you understand what you're actually suggesting? You're recommending that we voluntarily present ourselves to a species you have spent 5 years characterizing as a potential Category 7 threat. I'm recommending, Tessivor said, that we present ourselves as something other than a threat, while we still have the option. We are not a threat to them. They are a potential threat to, that's not what they'll see. Her voice was quiet and precise. If they reach the stars and find that we've been watching them for decades, observing, cataloging, making threat assessments, without ever making contact or offering aid, she stopped. Let the sentence find its own conclusion in the room. What would you conclude, Counselor, if you discovered that a civilization vastly more powerful than yours had been silently observing you for 40 years and said nothing? The room was quiet. Merith said, "You're saying we've already made the choice, we just haven't acknowledged it. I'm saying the choice we made by choosing inaction is now going to define what this contact looks like." The only question remaining is whether we define it ourselves or let them define it for us when they arrive. Borith spoke before he'd consciously decided to. How long? Savor looked at him. Their FTL program, the classified one, not the one they publish, is ahead of our projection. My revised estimate is 18 to 25 years, not 60. The room went very still. 41 years later, by hegemonic calendar, the first human FTL vessel entered hegemony-claimed space. It was not a warship. It was a research vessel, barely large enough to register on the outer detection grid, piloted by a crew of 7. It was broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. The broadcast was in 17 languages because the crew had apparently decided that if they were going to meet other civilizations, they were going to cover their bases. The content of the broadcast was, roughly translated, "Hello! We come in peace. We are very nervous. We brought snacks. Please respond." The Hegemonic Council debated for 9 hours whether the snack reference was a threat. Tessivor Ind, who had retired from active service 6 years prior and was technically not present in any official capacity, apparently happened to be in the building and apparently happened to be in the corridor outside the chamber when the debate entered its 4th hour, and could hear the debate through the door, and apparently said to no one in particular, "They're making a joke." That's what they do when they're afraid. She apparently said this loudly enough to be heard through the door. The research vessel's captain was a woman named Dr. Miriam Calloway, 51 years old, former structural engineer, current xenobiologist, who had spent the past 14 years arguing that first contact with extraterrestrial intelligence should be led by scientists rather than military personnel, and had eventually been proven correct in a way she found significantly more stressful than she had imagined during the argument. She was sitting in the command seat of the Threshold, the ship's name, when the response came through. The response was in English, accented, formal, slightly archaic in its grammatical construction, but English. "This is General Emerita Tessivor End of the Hegemonic Deliberative. I have been waiting 41 years to say, I told them you were coming. They didn't listen. We need to talk." Calloway stared at the speaker, turned to her communications officer, turned back to the speaker. "Did she say 41 years? "Yes. They've been watching us for 41 years? "Apparently." Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone that her crew would later describe as remarkable in its composure, "Put me through." When the channel opened, she said, "General Emerita, Dr. Miriam Calloway, captain of the Threshold, representing a few billion people, loosely speaking, in a representational capacity that I'll admit is somewhat improvised. You mentioned 41 years. 47 by your calendar," Tissaber's voice said. I rounded. "That's Calloway process this. Can I ask what you were doing for 47 years? Watching, filing reports, being ignored." A pause. "Eating terrible food, being ignored." A pause. "Eating terrible food." "We have terrible food. I hope yours is better." This was, by any measure, a deeply strange opening to humanity's first formal interstellar diplomatic exchange. It was also, Calloway would later say, the moment she stopped being afraid. Not because the situation was less dangerous than it had been 30 seconds before, but because the voice on the other end was clearly a person, tired, wry, patient in a way that implied a lot had happened, that hadn't gone the way she'd wanted, and Calloway knew how to talk to people. "Tell me," Calloway said, "about the reports." What Tissaver told her, over the following 6 hours, transmitted from a shuttle she had, apparently, already had pre-positioned near the contact coordinates because she had been doing this for 47 years and had learned to be ready, was the full account. The 3-page report, the council's laughter, the classified assessment, the private log she had never submitted. The medic who had crawled 60 meters under fire to reach a soldier who was already dead and then gone back to work the next morning. Calloway listened to all of it without interrupting. When Tessivore finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be felt. Then Calloway said, "The medic. Do you know what happened to her?" Tessivore's voice, when it came back, had changed. Not in any structural way, not in volume or pace, but in something underneath those things. The quality of a person speaking about something they have thought about for a long time. She survived the engagement. She remained in service for another 9 years. She is, by my last confirmed record, a practicing physician in your northeastern coastal region. She has 2 children. Do you know her name? Osei. Yara Osei. Calloway closed her eyes for a moment. She was not sure why. It felt important, somehow, to mark the moment, to let it exist completely before moving past it. A woman who had held 19 people alive through 59 days of conditions that shouldn't have permitted it, whom an alien general had been observing from orbit, who had become, without knowing it, the reason this conversation was happening at all. She doesn't know, Calloway said. No. That she was being watched. No. That she changed how you thought about us. A pause. I'm not certain she changed my thinking so much as confirmed it. I already suspected. She made it impossible to doubt. Another pause, different in quality, shorter, more deliberate. Dr. Calloway, I need to tell you something about the council, the ones who didn't listen. The ones who knew, Tessivore said, and still chose not to act. The classified assessment, the 4 members. They are no longer in their positions. The hegemony has changed significantly in 47 years, as things do. But the institutional logic that produced their decision is still present. There are members of the current council who believe, who genuinely believe, that the correct response to humanity's arrival is to establish parameters, boundaries, constraints described diplomatically as frameworks. And if we don't accept the frameworks, the silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the silence of someone choosing how honest to be. Then there are those who would prefer, Tessivore said carefully, to revisit their original assessment. Calloway opened her eyes, looked at the stars outside the viewport, which were just stars, the same stars she'd looked at her whole life, now suddenly organized differently, given new meaning by the knowledge of what moved between them. 47 years, she said. They had 47 years, and they spent it making threat assessments instead of making contact, and now we're here and they want to establish frameworks. Yes. Can I tell you something? Please. We don't. Calloway paused, and then chose the honest version. We are not good at frameworks. As a species, we don't. We try, we build institutions, we make agreements, and then something goes sideways and we start improvising. And the improvising is usually the part that matters. We're better at responding to what actually happens than to what we planned for. I know, Tessivore said. And something in those 2 words, the weight of 47 years of watching, the specific quality of knowledge earned through patience, made Calloway believe her completely. What do we do? You do what you do, Tessivore said. You talk to people. You tell them what you need. You keep moving. And when things go differently than planned, a pause, the longest yet, you find someone to sit with you in the dark, and you stay. The formal First Contact Summit convened 14 weeks later. Tessivore attended not as an official representative but as a consultant, her own description, which the council had accepted with the particular kind of institutional grace that means we cannot stop her. She sat at the edge of the chamber rather than the table, and she watched. Calloway sat at the table. She had brought 2 members of her crew. The hegemonic council had arrived with 23 advisors. 17 security personnel, a formal diplomatic protocol 700 pages long, and an expression of collective confidence that Tessivore recognized immediately as its own kind of fear. The council's opening representative began the formal address. It was measured, precise, and impressively long. It established frameworks. It proposed parameters. It outlined constraint mechanisms in language that was technically cooperative, in the sense that it described cooperation as something that would be permitted within the defined limits of the established framework. Calloway listened to all of it. Then she said, "I appreciate the preparation. Can I ask you something direct?" The representative blinked. Direct inquiry is, yes, permitted within the dialogue phase. What are you afraid of? The chamber went silent. The representative said, We are not. This is not a conversation framed around, you've been watching us for 47 years, Calloway said. Not aggressively, with the specific calm of someone who has thought about this for 14 weeks. That means you know what we're like. That means this framework was written by people who know what we're like and are trying to prepare for what we're like. Which means the framework is built around a fear. I'd like to know what it is, because I think we'll make a lot more progress if we talk about the actual thing. Tessivore, at the edge of the room, very quietly, folded her hands and was still. The representative looked at her colleagues, then back at Calloway, then at the table, as though the answer might be there. "We are afraid," he said finally, in a voice stripped of its diplomatic register, "that you will not stop." The room held it. "Stop what?" Calloway asked. "Whatever you decide to do." A long silence. "You're afraid," Calloway said slowly, working through it out loud, "that there's no version of no that we'll accept. We have studied every major civilization in this cluster. Every one of them, when faced with sufficient cost, accepts that some things cannot be obtained and adjusts. It is how civilizations remain stable. It is we are built around this assumption." The representative's voice was steady, but not entirely composed. "You do not appear to share this assumption, and a civilization that will not accept the word no is terrifying," Calloway said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, you're not wrong. We're not easy." Another pause. "But here's the other thing about a species that won't stop when it decides something matters. We also won't stop when we decide someone matters." She looked at the representative directly. 47 years ago, an officer of yours filed a report recommending you make contact. You didn't listen. She kept filing. She kept watching. She kept trying to get you to do the right thing." Calloway glanced toward the edge of the room, toward Tessivore, who was looking at her with an expression that might have been surprise. "That's not a human story. That's what happens when someone decides something is worth continuing for." She let it sit. "We can be that for you," she said, "or we can be the other thing. That part's actually your choice." The summit lasted 11 days. On the 6th day, an agreement was reached that the Council's diplomatic team described as a framework, and Calloway's team described as a starting point, and Tessivore privately described as better than nothing, which is what we had for 47 years, so I'll take it. On the 8th day, Calloway asked if she could send a message to a physician in the northeastern coastal region of Earth. A private one. No official channels. The Council agreed, technically, in the sense that nothing in the established framework explicitly prohibited it. The message read, "Dr. O.C., my name is Miriam Calloway. I am currently in a room full of aliens. I need to tell you something important. You don't know this, but you've been observed, not in a threatening way. In the way that changes minds. A general watched you crawl across 60 meters of contested ground in the dark to reach someone who was already gone. She watched you stay with them for 4 minutes. She watched you go back to work the next morning. She has been trying to protect us ever since. Because of that, I don't know what you'll do with this. I imagine it's a strange thing to receive. But I thought you should know the work you did in those 59 days in conditions that had no right to produce anything except despair, it mattered. Across a distance you couldn't have imagined, in a way you could never have predicted, it mattered. The coffee machine is probably fixed by now. I hope so. Thank you. Yara Osei read this message on a Tuesday morning in her practice in Accra between patients. She read it 3 times, sat with it in the particular way she had learned long ago to sit with things that were too large to process immediately, not suppressing them, not running from them, just letting them be present until they found their proper dimension. Then she went back to work. She was, in this, exactly what Tasavvur had always said she was, exactly what the Council had never been able to fully account for, exactly what no framework could contain, predict, or outlast. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced species to reach the stars, or the most strategically sophisticated, or the most rationally optimized for survival in a universe that does not care what you survive for. Just the one that, when it decided something was worth continuing for, had not yet found the point at which it would stop. The galaxy, over the centuries that followed, would learn to call this many things: a threat, a wonder, a mystery, a force, an act of madness that kept producing outcomes that madness shouldn't produce. Tasavvur in the final entry of the private log she had kept for 47 years. The one she finally published at 93 years old, 3 years before she died, under a title that translated roughly as "What I Saw When No One Else Was Looking," described it in one line. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are simply the only ones who never learned to stop caring what happens after they're gone. The entry was dated, time-stamped, filed, and somewhere in Accra on a Tuesday that had already moved past the moment. A doctor with 2 children and 59 days she carried quietly inside her, went back to her next patient and kept going and kept going and kept going, the way humans do, the way they have always done, past every rational stopping point, past every logical threshold, past every moment that should have been the end. Because there was someone in the next room who needed her. And that, it turned out, was enough.